Hi, class. Welcome to our second lecture on the Acts of the Apostles. The last lecture, we just kind of basically went through an outline and talked about some of the important features of that outline, structurally, how the movement in Acts goes from Jerusalem to Rome or from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. There's these concentric circles that work out from the center in Jerusalem for Acts. There's a movement really from James to Paul. James being the leader of the church in Jerusalem, Paul being sent to Rome by the end of the narrative. So there's that. I do want us to look at the prelude of Acts, which is found in chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. I have to turn there, so give me 2 seconds. That prelude's important because it'll show you how Acts functions as chapter 2 or volume 2 to the Gospel of Luke. So in your own time, read Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 over against this in your own time. This is Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus did and taught from the beginning until the day when he was taken up to heaven after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. And then he goes on to, after his suffering, he presented himself alive to them. So basically talking about the resurrection and then ascension. But that's important. In the first book, that's the Gospel of Luke. Clearly, this is the second book that accompanies the Gospel of Luke. And now he's narrating what happens. This is the story of the church. Gallaudet says that the Acts of the Apostles is the story of the church. And I would only add to that this is the story of the church for sure. But it's the church that has been empowered and infused by the Holy Spirit. I mean, that is clear in Acts from the very beginning. Once Jesus is taken into heaven, the Holy Spirit descends on the apostles in Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost. So the prelude's very important. It shows you how Luke and Acts are knitted together. Now, another theme that's very important in the Acts of the Apostles is something that Ehrman says repeatedly. I think he said it like 3 times in his chapter on the Acts of the Apostles, and that's the fact that 1/4 of Acts, and Acts is 28 chapters. Acts is a very long writing for the New Testament. A full 1/4, 1/4 of Acts is speeches. So there are these long sermons that Luke puts on the lips of Peter, Stephen, and Paul in particular. Now there are smaller speeches too on the lips of James and Philip and people who are kind of lesser, have less importance from a quantitative point of view. In other words, they aren't mentioned that much, but they still have speeches. These long speeches are really important because Luke was not there at any of them, we don't think. Although there's these sections in Acts where he says, we traveled to XYZ when he's talking to Paul. It looks like he's trying to say that he was with Paul in Paul's travels. Few scholars believe that Luke actually accompanied Paul on any of his missionary journeys. So this is a literary device to show his closeness to Paul. But that's important to note. But these speeches on the lips of Paul, on the lips of Peter, Stephen in particular, shows a pattern that Luke has produced all through the Gospel of Luke and throughout the Acts of the Apostles. And Luke is trying to narrate a break between Judaism proper and Jews who became believers in Jesus. And even more specifically, Luke is trying to explain how a very Jewish movement became largely Gentile. Now, I don't think by the time Luke is writing this, the Jesus movement was mostly Gentile or all Gentile, and that there was a hard break already. I think there was a lot of fracture happening because all these folks were trying to figure out exactly what this movement was. And if Gentiles were allowed to come into the movement without becoming Jewish, then what is the movement? I mean, that is the nature of so many writings in the New Testament. And Luke Acts is really trying to explain that from a very specific point of view. So just like Jesus tended to be, when Jesus preached in the Gospel of Luke, there were a lot of people who believed, there were Jewish, and then there were a lot of people who really rejected what Jesus said, and they were also Jewish. So there is a fracture internal to Judaism that Luke is narrating. And he says the fracture happens a lot about the message of Jesus, but it goes along the lines of Gentiles. A lot of people in the movement felt like Gentiles did not have to be circumcised or follow the law of Moses to be a follower of Jesus. And Acts certainly narrates that. Acts tells the story of Cornelius, who was a Roman centurion. I mean, these are bad guys, really. And this Roman centurion was brought into the faith of Jesus Christ by Peter, because Peter had this vision that Gentiles were clean already. And so that is the nature of the friction that's being narrated in Luke Acts. And Acts is basically saying the Jews who are rejecting the fact that Gentiles can be allowed in without becoming Jewish, that they are being rejected by God. Now, the question is how anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish that is. But that's exactly what Acts is doing. Is narrating that shift that's happening in Luke's own lifetime. A shift from a very Jewish movement to more of a Gentile movement. And Luke is trying to say exactly how that happened. And he does so in a lot of the speeches by Peter, by Stephen, and by Paul. Those three in particular give speeches that are very informative of how Luke understands the movement of Christianity from a Jewish movement into a Gentile inclusive movement. So be very aware as you read through Acts. Watch that movement that's happening there, and it's indicative in the gospel too. So that's even more of how these two come together. Something else that's really important to pay close attention to as you read the Acts, and Gail O'Day in her small commentary on Acts that we're reading this week, she says this: when Acts retells stories, that's also very important. So the story of Cornelius, which is found in chapter 10, Luke has Peter retell that story in chapter 11, I think 11, 1 through 18. So the event happens in chapter 10, and then Peter retells the story in chapter 11 to another audience. So that repetition is very important for Luke to kind of get his point across. And that story is specifically related to Gentiles becoming a part of the movement. And Peter says the Holy Spirit did it. I mean, he blames the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit came in, and these Gentiles received the Holy Spirit by the Holy Spirit's volition. And what can I do except acknowledge that? That's what Peter says. So it's kind of like this inevitability that this was God's doing, not Peter's doing, and what. So that story is retold. The other story that's retold is Paul's transformation, Paul's revelation, or Jesus' revelation to Paul on the way to Damascus. That story is first told in Acts chapter 9, where Paul has that great revelation, and retold. Paul basically retells his story twice in chapter 22 and chapter 26. I think I misspoke on the last lecture and said 28. But Paul's conversion or transformation or the revelation of Christ to Paul is a pivotal moment in Acts. Luke Acts understands Paul as the one who is instrumental in delivering the gospel of Jesus Christ to Gentiles. Now, that's fundamentally different than the way Paul says he did it. Like the way Luke says Paul did it and the way Paul says Paul did it is completely different. They both agree that Paul did it, right? So Paul was the one who was instrumental on preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to Gentiles. And that dramatically shifted the nature of the movement itself. The inclusion of the Gentiles transformed the Jesus movement from its Jewishness, from its Jewish origin, from its Jewish movement into something inclusive of Gentiles. And when the Gentiles really started coming in, that dramatically reshaped the Jesus movement. And it's that inclusion that caused so much controversy in early Christianity. I mean, the Gospel of Matthew deals with it. James deals with it. Paul deals with it in almost every letter he writes. Luke Acts deals with it. Almost every major writing in the New Testament deals with the issue of the inclusion of the Gentiles. And Acts certainly narrates that story. So in that retelling, that retelling of those stories about Paul in particular and Cornelius both deal with the gospel going to Gentiles. So that is some of the main themes in Acts. I think Gail O'Day does a great job talking about focusing on women in Acts. There's this Acts refers to women in general, but there are 5 key stories that Luke tells in Acts where he names women. And read that. That's one mode of reading when you say, okay, I'm going to pay attention to the way women are portrayed in Acts or the Gospels or whatever reading. That brings with it a feminist lens, which is important because when you start reading to find women in the text, what you find is in 28 chapters, there are 5 stories. That's not a lot, but that's more than most. And so how are these women portrayed? Do they have power, or is it kind of paternalistic? Those are the kind of questions that feminists ask when they read the text. If it is paternalistic and demeaning, how do you kind of resist the text itself? How do you read against the grain? These are reading strategies that are done for ethical purposes. And I think Gail O'Day's chapter on Acts in the Women's Bible Commentary is a great example of that. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thanks.